So,
Do you think psychedelics that I just mentioned earlier have a possibility of going to these kind of same kind of places of exploring ideas that are outside of our more commonplace understanding of the world?
yeah, I think so. Absolutely. However, I think we have to be really careful about those because young people or people in general, I should say, absolutely can get hurt by them. I mean, but we get hurt by alcohol. We drive our cars and we
Yeah.
kill each other. But psychedelics are really interesting because I know that within the history of our country, we have used psychedelics in various capacities for our military in order to try to stimulate ideas and access places and information that can't be accessed normally. This is all fact.
Yeah. I talked to Matt for like 4 hours, so we ran out of time being able to talk. But I wanted to talk to him about MK Ultra and Ted Kaczynski. There's so many mysterious things there. There's like layers of what's known and what's not known. It's fascinating. But I think what is interesting is psychedelics were used or were attempted to be used as tools of different kinds. That's the point. So like we think of technology as tools to enable us to do things. And that same way that psychedelics, like many drugs, could be used as tools, some more effective than others.
Absolutely.
I don't think I'm not sure what you can do effectively with alcohol. Although I think somebody commented somewhere on social media that I don't know why everyone is so negative about alcohol, because I think the person said that it's given me some of the most incredible, it enabled me to let go and have some of the most incredible experiences with friends in my life. And it's true. We kind of sometimes say alcohol is dangerous. It can make you do horrible. But the reality is it's also a fascinating tool for letting go of trying to be somebody maybe that you're not, and allowing you to be yourself fully in whatever crazy form that is, and allow you to have really deep and interesting experiences with those you love. So yeah, even alcohol can be used as an effective tool for exploring experiences and becoming expanding your mind and becoming a better person. So what the hell was I talking about? So psychedelics and MK Ultra. Is there something interesting to say in our historical use of psychedelics?
I mean, think about it. When did we start doing that? When did we start using those?
That's true. It's quite a long time ago, right?
But true. But when did our government start experimenting with them with us? Okay.
Our government is the United States government.
Yeah. Right? Okay. So that happened in around the 1950s. Okay. After quote unquote the 1940s, where we have 47 and we have, this Roswell type stuff going on. Okay. Yes. Like crash sites and things like that. So I think that, I think there might be a correlation there. I don't know what it is. Okay. But I do think
fascinating, actually. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting things started
around that time period.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Aldous Huxley would say we opened the doors of perception. Okay. And what flew in?
Oh, man. That was beautifully. Can I ask you about chemical substances that affect the video game, the dream world? So psychedelics that increasingly have been getting a lot of research done on them. So in general, psychedelics, psilocybin, MDMA, but also a really interesting one, the big one, which is DMT. What and where are the places that these substances take the mind that is operating in the dream world? Do you have an interesting sense how this throws a wrinkle into the prediction model? Is it just some weird little quirk, or is there some fundamental expansion of the mind going on?
I suspect that a way to look at psychedelics is that they induce particular types of lucid dreaming states. So it's a state in which certain connections are being severed in your mind. They're no longer active. Your mind basically gets free to move in a certain direction because some particular inhibition doesn't work anymore. And as a result, you might stop having a self, or you might stop perceiving the world as three-dimensional. And you can explore that state. And I suppose that for every state that can be induced with psychedelics, there are people that are naturally in that state. So sometimes psychedelics just shift you through a range of possible mental states, and they can also shift you out of the range of permissible mental states, that is, where you can make predictive models of reality. And what I observe in people that use psychedelics a lot is that they tend to be overfitting. Overfitting means that you are using more bits for modeling the dynamics of a function than you should. And so you can fit your curve to extremely detailed things in the past, but this model is no longer predictive for the future.
What is it about psychedelics that forces that? I thought it would be the opposite. I thought that it's a good mechanism for generalization, for regularization. So it feels like psychedelics expansion of the mind, like taking you outside of, like forcing your model to be non-predictive is a good thing. Meaning like it's almost like, okay, what I would say psychedelics are akin to is traveling to a totally different environment. Like going, if you've never been to like India or something like that from the United States, very different set of people, different culture, different food, different roads and values and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, so psychedelics can, for instance, teleport people into a universe that is hyperbolic, which means that if you imagine a room that you're in, you can turn around 360 degrees and you didn't go full circle. You need to go 720 degrees to go full circle.
Exactly.
So the things that people learn in that state cannot be easily transferred in this universe that we are in. It could be that if they're able to abstract and understand what happened to them, that they understand that some part of their spatial cognition has been desynchronized and has found a different synchronization. And this different synchronization happens to be a hyperbolic one, right? So you learn something interesting about your brain. It's difficult to understand what exactly happened, but we get a pretty good idea once we understand how the brain is representing geometry.
Yeah, but doesn't it give you a fresh perspective on the physical reality? Who's making that sound? Is it inside my head or is it external?
Well, there is no sound outside of your mind, but it's making sense of phenomena in physics.
In the physical reality, there's sound waves traveling through air. Okay.
That's our model of what happened.
That's a model of what happened, right. Don't psychedelics give you a fresh perspectives on this physical reality? Like on not this physical reality, but this more what do you call the dream world? That's mapped directly to
the purpose of dreaming at night. I think is data augmentation.
Well, exactly. So you
that's
basically very different. That's very similar to psychedelics.
Change parameters about the things that you have learned. And for instance, when you are young, you have seen things from certain perspectives, but not from others. Yeah. So your brain is generating new perspectives of objects that you already know, which means they can learn to recognize them later from different perspectives. And I suspect that's the reason why many of us remember to have flying dreams as children, because it's just different perspectives of the world that we already know. And that it starts to generate these different perspective changes, and then it fluidly turns this into a flying dream to make sense of what's happening, right? So you fill in the gaps, and suddenly you see yourself flying. And similar things can happen with semantic relationships. So it's not just spatial relationships, but it can also be the relationships between ideas that are being changed. And it seems that the mechanisms that make that happen during dreaming are interacting with these same receptors that are being stimulated by psychedelics. So I suspect that there is a thing that I haven't read really about. The way in which dreams are induced in the brain is not just that the activity of the brain gets tuned down because you are somehow your eyes are closed and you no longer get enough data from your eyes, but there is a particular type of neurotransmitter that is saturating your brain during these phases, during the REM phases, and you produce controlled hallucinations. Mm-hmm. And psychedelics are linking into these mechanisms, I suspect.
So isn't that another trickier form of data augmentation?
Yes. But it's also data augmentation that can happen outside of the specification that your brain is tuned to. So basically, people are overclocking their brains, and that produces states that are subjectively extremely interesting.
Yeah,
But from the outset, very suspicious.
So I think I'm over-applying the metaphor of a neural network in my own mind, which I just think that doesn't lead to overfitting, right? But you were just sort of anecdotally saying my experiences with people that have done psychedelics are that kind of quality.
I think it typically happens. So if you look at people like Timothy Leary, and he has written beautiful manifestos about the effect of LSD on people. He genuinely believed, he writes in these manifestos, that in the future, science and art will only be done on psychedelics because it's so much more efficient and so much better. And he gave LSD to children in his community of a few thousand people that he had near San Francisco. And basically, he was losing touch with reality. He did not understand the effects that the things that he was doing would have on the reception of psychedelics by society, because he was unable to think critically about what happened. What happened was that he got in a euphoric state. Mm-hmm. That euphoric state happened because he was overfitting. He was taking this sense of euphoria and translating it into a model of actual success in the world. Right? He was feeling better. Limitations had disappeared that he experienced to be existing, but he didn't get superpowers.
I understand what you mean by overfitting now. There's a lot of interpretation to the term overfitting in this case, but I got you. So he was getting positive rewards from a lot of actions that he shouldn't have been
but not just
taking.
this. So if you take, for instance, John Lilly, who was studying dolphin languages and aliens and so on, a lot of people that used psychedelics became very loopy. And the typical thing that you notice when people are on psychedelics is that they are in a state where they feel that everything can be explained now. Everything is clear. Everything is obvious.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have indeed discovered a useful connection, but not always. Very often these connections are over-interpretations.
I wonder, there's a question of correlation versus causation. And also I wonder if it's the psychedelics or if it's more the social, like being the outsider and having a strong community of outside and having a leadership position in an outsider cult-like community, that could have a much stronger effect of overfitting than do psychedelics themselves, the actual substances, because it's a counterculture thing. So it could be that as opposed to the actual substance. If you're a boring person who wears a suit and tie and works at a bank and takes psychedelics, that could be a very different effect of psychedelics on your mind. I'm just sort of raising the point that the people you referenced are already weirdos. I'm not sure exactly.
Oh, no, not necessarily. A lot of the people that tell me that they use psychedelics in a useful way started out as squares and were liberating themselves because they were stuck. They were basically stuck in local optimum of their own self-model, of their relationship to the world, and suddenly they had data augmentation. They basically saw and experienced a space of possibilities. They experienced what it would be like to be another person.
Yeah.
And they took important lessons from that experience back home.
Yeah, I mean, I love the metaphor of data augmentation because that's been the primary driver of self-supervised learning in the computer vision domain is data augmentation. So it's funny to think of data like chemically induced data augmentation in the human mind.
There's also a very interesting effect that I noticed. I know several people who swear to me that LSD has cured their migraines. So severe cluster headaches or migraines that didn't respond to standard medication that disappeared after a single dose. And I don't recommend anybody doing this, especially not in the US where it's illegal. And there are no studies on this for that reason. But it seems that anecdotally that it basically can reset the serotonergic system. So it's basically pushing them outside of their normal boundaries. And as a result, it needs to find a new equilibrium. And in some people, that equilibrium is better. But it also follows that in other people, it might be worse. So if you have a brain that is already teetering on the boundary to psychosis, it can be permanently pushed over that boundary.
Well, that's why you have to do good science, which they're starting to do on all these different substances of how well it actually works for the different conditions. Like MDMA seems to help with PTSD. Same with psilocybin. That, you need to do good science, meaning large studies of large N.
Yeah, so based on the existing studies with MDMA, it seems that if you look at Rick Doblin's work and what he has published about this and talks about, MDMA seems to be a psychologically relatively safe drug, but it's physiologically not very safe. That is, there is neurotoxicity if you would use a too large dose, and if you combine this with alcohol, which a lot of kids do in party settings during raves and so on, it's very hepatotoxic. So basically, you can kill your liver. And this means that it's probably something that is best and most productively used in a clinical setting by people who really know what they're doing. And I suspect that's also true for the other psychedelics. That is, while the other psychedelics are probably not as toxic as, say, alcohol, the effects on the psyche can be much more profound and lasting.
Yeah. Well, as far as I know, psilocybin, so mushrooms, magic mushrooms, as far as I know, in terms of the studies they're running, I think have they're allowed to do what they're calling heroic doses. So that one does not have a toxicity. So they can do like huge doses in a clinical setting when they're doing study on psilocybin, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, it seems that most of the psychedelics work in extremely small doses, which means that the effect on the rest of the body is relatively low. And MDMA is probably the exception. Maybe ketamine can be dangerous in larger doses because it can depress breathing and so on. But the LSD and psilocybin work in very, very small doses, at least the active part of them. Of psilocybin, LSD is only the active part. And but the effect that it can have on your mental wiring can be very dangerous, I think.
I wonder how to experiment with the mind without any medical assistance first. Like, I pushed my mind in all kinds of directions. I definitely want to. I did shrooms a couple of times. I definitely want to figure out how I can experiment with psychedelics. I'm talking to Rick Doblin, I think. Doblin. Soon. I went back and forth. So he does all these studies on psychedelics, and he keeps ignoring the parts of my email that asks, like, how do I participate in these studies?
Yeah, well, there are some legality issues. I mean, conversation, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that anyone should run out and do psychedelics. I think that drowsy states and sleep states are super interesting for accessing some of these more creative states of mind. Hypnosis is something that my colleague David Spiegel, Associate Chair of Psychiatry at Stanford, works on, where also, again, it's a unique state because you have narrow context. So this is very kind of tunnel vision and yet deeply relaxed, where new algorithms, if you will, can start to surface. Strong state for inducing neuroplasticity. And I think that, so if I had I'm part of a group that it's called the Liminal Collective, as a group of people that get together and talk about just wild ideas, but they try and implement. And it's a really interesting group. Some people from military, from Logitech, and some other backgrounds, academic backgrounds. And I was asked, what would be if you could create a tool, if you just had a tool like your magic wand wish for the day, what would it be? I thought it would be really interesting if someone could develop psychedelics that have on-off switches. So you could go into a psychedelic state very deeply for 10 minutes, but you could launch yourself out of that state and place yourself into a linear real world state very quickly, so that you could extract whatever it was that happened in that experience and then go back in if you wanted. Because the problem with psychedelic states and dream states is that, first of all, a lot of the reason people do them is they're lying. They say they want plasticity and they want all this stuff. Mm-hmm. They want a peak experience inside of an amplified experience. So they're kind of seeking something unusual. And I think we should just be honest about that, because a lot of times they're not trying to make their brain better. They're just trying to experience something really amazing. But the problem is space and time are so unlocked in these states, just like they are in dreams, that you can really end up with a whole lot of nothing. You can have an amazing amplified experience housed in an amplified experience and come out of that thinking you had a meaningful experience when you didn't bring anything back.
You didn't bring anything back. All you have is a fuzzy memory of having a transformational experience.
Right.
But you don't actually have tools to bring back.
That's right.
Actual concrete ideas to bring back. Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if it's possible to do that with the mind to be able to hop back and forth.
Well, I think that's where the real power of, adjusting states is going to be. It probably will be with devices. Maybe it'll be done through pharmacology. It's just that it's hard to do on-off switches in human pharmacology. That we have them for animals. We have Cre-flip recombinases, and we have channel opsins and halorhodopsins and all these kinds of things. But to do that work in humans is tricky. But I think you could do it with virtual reality, augmented reality, and other devices that bring more of the somatic experience.
Let me ask you a little bit about psychedelics, because there have been a lot of excellent research on different psychedelics, psilocybin, MDMA, even DMT, drugs in general, marijuana too. What do you think psychedelics do to the human mind? It seems they take the human mind to some interesting places. Is that just a little hack, a visual hack, or is there some profound expansion of the mind?
So let's see. I don't believe in magic. I believe in science, in causality. Still, let's say, and then as I said, I think that the brain, our subjective experience of reality is we live in the simulation run by our brain, and the simulation that our brain runs, they can be very pleasant or very hellish. Drugs, they are changing some hyperparameters of the simulation. It is possible, thanks to change of these hyperparameters, to actually look back on your experience and even see that the given things that we took for granted, they are changeable. So they allow to have a amazing perspective. There is also, for instance, the fact that after DMT, people can see the full movie inside of their head. Gives me further belief that the brain can generate the full movie, that the brain is actually learning the model of reality to such extent that it tries to predict what's going to happen next.
Yeah, very high resolution, so it can replay reality, essentially.
Extremely high resolution. Yeah, it's also kind of interesting to me that somehow there seems to be some similarity between these drugs and meditation itself. And I actually started even these days to think about meditation as a psychedelic.
Do you practice meditation?
I practice meditation. I went a few times on the retreats, and it feels after second or third day of meditation, there is almost like a sense of tripping.
What does a meditation retreat entail?
So, you wake up early in the morning and you meditate for an extended period of time. And
alone? Sorry to keep interrupting.
Yeah, so it's optimized, even though there are other people, it's optimized for isolation. So you don't speak with anyone, you don't actually look into other people's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And, you sit on the chair. Say Vipassana meditation tells you to focus on the breath. So you try to put all attention into breathing and breathing in and breathing out. And crazy thing is that as you focus attention like that, after some time, there's starts coming back some memories that you completely forgotten. Mm-hmm. It almost feels like that you have a mailbox, and then you are just archiving email one by one. Mm-hmm. And at some point, there is this amazing feeling of getting to mailbox zero emails, and it's very pleasant. It's crazy to me that once you resolve these inner stories or like inner traumas, then once there is nothing left, the default state of human mind is extremely peaceful and happy. Extreme, like some sense, it feels that it feels, at least to me, the way how when I was a child, that I can look at any object and it's very beautiful. I have a lot of curiosity about the simple things, and that's where usually meditation takes me.
What are you experiencing? Are you just taking in simple sensory information and are just enjoying the rawness of that sensory information? So there's no memories or all that kind of stuff. You're just enjoying being.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, still there is it's thoughts are slowing down. Sometimes they pop up, but it's also somehow the extended meditation takes you to the space that they are way more friendly, way more positive. There is also this thing that we've it almost feels that we are constantly getting a little bit of a reward function, and we are just spreading this reward function on various activities. But if you stay still for extended period of time, it kind of accumulates, and there is a sense that at some point it passes some threshold, and it feels as drop is falling into kind of ocean of love and bliss, and that's like this is like a very pleasant, and that's what I'm saying, like that corresponds to the subjective experience. Some people, I guess, in spiritual community, they describe it that's the reality, and I would say I believe that there are like all sorts of subjective experience that one can have, and I believe that, for instance, meditation might take you to the subjective experiences which are very pleasant, collaborative, and I would like a world to move toward a more collaborative place. Yeah, I would say that's very pleasant, and I enjoy doing stuff like that.
I wonder how that maps to your mathematical model of love with the reward function combining a bunch of things. It seems like our life then is we have this reward function and we're accumulating a bunch of stuff in it with weights. It's like multi-objective, and what meditation is you just remove them until the weight on one or just a few is very high, and that's where the pleasure comes from.
Yeah, so something similar how I'm thinking about this. So I told you that there is this there is a story of who you are, and I think almost about it as a text prepended to GPT.
Yeah,
and some people refer to it as ego. Okay, there's like a story who you are. Okay,
so ego is the prompt for GPT-3 or GPT.
Yes, and that's the description of you. And then with meditation, you can get to the point that actually you experience things without the prompt, and you experience things like as they are. You are not biased toward the description how they're supposed to be. That's very pleasant. And then with respect to the reward function, it's possible to get to the point that there is dissolution of self, and therefore you can say that you're having your brain attempts to simulate the reward function of everyone else or like everything. That there is this like a love which feels like a oneness with everything, and that's also very beautiful, very pleasant. At some point, you might have a lot of altruistic thoughts during that moment, and then the self always comes back.
How would you recommend, if somebody is interested in meditation, like a big thing to take on as a project, would you recommend a meditation retreat? How many days? What kind of thing would you recommend?
I think that actually retreat is the way to go. It almost feels that, as I said, like meditation is a psychedelic, but when you take it in the small dose, you might barely feel it. Once you get the high dose, actually you're going to feel it.
So even cold turkey, if you haven't really seriously meditated for a prolonged period of time, just go to a retreat.
Yeah.
How many days?
How many days? Start weekend one.
Weekend, so like 2-3 days.
And it's it's interesting that first or second day, it's hard, and at some point it becomes easy.
There's a lot of seconds in a day. How hard is the meditation retreat? Just sitting there in a chair?
So the thing is actually, it literally just depends on your your own framing. Like if you are in the mindset that you are waiting for it to be over, or you are waiting for nirvana to happen, it will be very unpleasant.
Yeah.
And in some sense, even the difficulty, it's not even in the lack of being able to speak with others. Like you are sitting there, your legs will hurt from sitting.
In terms of like the practical things, do you experience kind of discomfort, like physical discomfort of just sitting, like your butt being numb, your legs being sore, all that kind of stuff?
Yes, you experience it, and then they teach you to observe it rather. And it's like the crazy thing is, you at first might have a feeling toward trying to escape it,
Yeah.
and that becomes very apparent that that's extremely unpleasant. And then you just observe it, and at some point it just becomes it just is. It's like I remember with Ilya told me some time ago that he takes a cold shower, and his mindset of taking a cold shower was to embrace suffering.
Yeah. Excellent. I do the same.
This is your style?
Yeah, it's my style. I like this.
So my style is actually, I also sometimes take cold showers.
Yeah.
It is purely observing how the water goes through my body, like purely being present, not trying to escape from there.
Yeah.
And I would say then it actually becomes pleasant. It's not like,
Well, that's interesting. I'm also that's the way to deal with anything really difficult, especially in the physical space, is to observe it. To say it's pleasant, I would use a different word. You're accepting of the full beauty of reality, I would say, because say pleasant. But yeah, I mean, in some sense, it is pleasant. That's the only way to deal with a cold shower, is to become an observer and to find joy in it. Same with like really difficult physical exercise, or like running for a really long time, endurance events. Just anytime you're exhausted, any kind of pain, I think the only way to survive it is not to resist it, is to observe it. There's a little bit of an inkling of religious longing for meaning in the way people conceive of aliens currently. I talked to a bunch of people about UFOs and UAPs and aliens, and so to me it's very interesting for perhaps different reasons, because I look up to the stars, and it's incredibly humbling to me to think that there's trillions of intelligent alien civilizations out there, which to me seems likely, or not, perhaps not intelligent, perhaps just alien life. And actually also that we don't even understand what it means to be intelligent, or do we understand what it means to be alive? The time scale, the spatial scale, which patterns of atoms can form in a way that you can call life, it just could be way weirder than we can imagine. And certainly way different than human life. Anyway, that to me is humbling. And so it's almost like with the simulation, conceiving of the world as simulation, thinking of aliens to me is a useful thought experiment of like, what would aliens look like if they visited? How would we know? How would we communicate with them? How would we send signals to them? If they're already here and we don't see them, how's that possible? That seems to me actually likely. That would just be too self-centered and too dumb to see them if they're already here. Anyway, but so that's kind of the almost the pragmatic, the engineering, the physics sense of aliens. But there's also kind of a longing to connect with other intelligent beings out there, both the fear and the excitement of that, that has kind of a religious aspect to it,
Sure.
that I find fascinating. And in the right context, when you remove the skepticism of government from that, it's actually a hopeful longing. Do you see this kind of interest in aliens as at all connected to your study of religion?
So you're the first person to ask me about aliens. in 8 months. So it looks like I'm going on the record.
Let's go. Let's go.
So I'll drop some J. Allen Hynek on you. So Hynek, involved in Project Blue Book, famously says in 1966, when the long-awaited solution to the UFO problem comes, and we're assuming that UFOs have something to do with aliens, but when the long-awaited solution comes, I believe it will prove to be not merely the next small step in the march of science, but a mighty and unexpected quantum leap. In other words, I do not think that we're dealing with flesh and blood beings in nuts and bolts crafts. I think it's way, way more complicated than that. And if anything, it takes me back to the ancient world. It takes me back to this invisible college of beings of apparent higher intent. It takes me to the geniuses and the muses. So the first document in Western civilization, Homer's epics, they begin by invoking an alien. They invoke a muse. Andra moyenepa musa polutraban hos malapola. Tell me, O muse, about the man. So Homer isn't inventing poetry. He's channeling poetry, epic poetry, from an alien intelligence. Maybe that intelligence has felt a little unrecognized in recent years.
Trying to show up in human recognizable forms. The muse is trying to give little hints of its existence. Yeah, I mean, I've been saying, I honestly I don't believe this, but I think about this, whether like muse is a great example, whether aliens could be thoughts. Ideas we have are the aliens, or consciousness itself is the methods by which aliens communicate with us. Like, I find this very kind of liberating to expand our conception of what intelligent beings are.
You would like Julian Jaynes. Julian Jaynes writes a great book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. It's this theory that the ancient Greek mind was very different from ours, and that when they heard the muses, or the gods and goddesses for that matter, they would hear them as voices in the head and hear it as an internal God figure offering commands, which they couldn't ignore. So were they walking schizophrenics? It might be one way to talk about it before the breakdown of the bicameral mind. But it's a provocative theory, largely untestable. But when you're reading ancient Greek, and Latin for that matter, you can't read it very long without bumping up against these discarnate entities. They're everywhere. And they survived. They persist across time, which is even stranger. Not just in the form of all the things my daughters like fairies and gnomes and elves, but, and McKenna loves this, the sylphs and the boulder grinders and the sprites and the jinns and elementals. Every society has them. It seems to be fairly universal. And they largely exist in folklore, mythology. This is what Jacques Vallée writes about so wonderfully.
Let me ask you about, because you mentioned NYU, what I find fascinating is how much amazing research there is, speaking of science, right? Studying the effects of psilocybin, studying the effects of various psychedelics, MDMA, on the human mind. Right now for helping people, but I'm hoping there'll be studies soon at Hopkins and elsewhere that allow people that are kind of more, quote unquote, creatives or regular people that don't have a particular demon they're trying to work through, a problem they're trying to work through, but more like to see what can I find if I utilize psychedelics to explore. Is there something you could say that is exciting to you, that's promising about the future, what currently is going on, but also the future of psychedelics research?
Yeah.
Hopkins and elsewhere.
The healthy normals. I
was looking for the right words, because normal doesn't feel... Healthy doesn't feel like a good term, and normal doesn't feel like a good term, because we're all pretty messed up and we're all weird. So,
well, those with ontological angst in that case.
Great.
Maybe there'll be a future DSM qualification.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that things like psilocybin, MDMA are useful for things like anxiety, depression, end-of-life distress, PTSD, alcoholism, you name it. And it's largely because of the clinical research that MDMA and psilocybin will probably be legal in some FDA-regulated way in the next 5 years. But I mean, again, I start the first page of my book with this question: why do psychedelics work across all these different conditions? And the best that I could find is the meaning, right? Tony Bossis at NYU talks about psilocybin, for example, as meaning-making medicine, which is interesting because it puts it somewhere between a therapeutic and, again, this ontological instigator. What is it about psychedelics that creates these mystical experiences or mystical-like experiences? You can call them emotional breakthroughs. You can call them moments of awe. I do think we get locked up in the language, and we're somewhere between science and religion here, including legally. So the FDA is one route to this. What excites me about psychedelics is the First Amendment. What is this going to mean for religion? The freedom of religion being the first thing that's mentioned in the First Amendment before freedom of speech, freedom of assembly.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
If America is known for anything, it's a refuge for religious pioneers. And so we already have the Native American church, Brazilian-spawned churches that are using psychedelics. But what would happen if Judaism or Christianity or Islam were to begin incorporating the very ritual, very sacred, and discreet use of psychedelics as part of their liturgy? So not replacing the Sunday Eucharist in the case of Christianity, but part of the extra credit dimension of the faith.
Credit. And then we can, through practice, figure out how essential it is. It could be a minor thing. It could be a major thing. Fascinating. But also, because of your work, I came across and exchanged a few emails with Patrick McGovern, who's basically, what would you call him? So he has a center, I guess, does biomolecular archaeology at UPenn. And he's the author of a bunch of books, one of which is Ancient Brews. So he's a scholar of beer and wine and like ancient alcohol, which is fascinating. The influence, even just alcohol, but he has like alcohol with hallucinogenic properties as well. But it's fascinating the influence. As a Russian, it's fascinating to think about the influence of alcohol on the development of human civilization throughout its history. Is there something you can comment on alcohol or in general Patrick's work that was informative to you, inspiring, or kind of added to your conception of human history?
His work was some of the first hard scientific data that I saw for the ritual consumption of these intoxicants. I don't think he's ever found the hard and fast data for psychedelics, but what he turned me on to was this idea that alcohol, or beer and wine specifically, could have been used as vehicles for the administration of psychedelics. That's where it all started for me. Just the notion that ancient beer and ancient wine is very, very different from what we drink today, that typically they were cocktails. They were often fortified and mixed with different fruits, berries, herbs, plants, maybe even fungi over time, because this was all in the absence of distilled liquor, right? There is no hard alcohol, even in Russia, before maybe the 12th century it was in Europe, maybe a bit earlier. But the concept of distillation just didn't exist. And so, to pack a punch, rather than just drink a kind of watered down Budweiser, these people were interested in fortifying these beverages with whatever they could find in nature. And Pat, to his credit, found some of the initial data for these, you could say, spiked wines and spiked beers. Not with anything overtly psychedelic, but just the fact that in the 16th century BC, at Grave Circle A in Mycenae, there's this Minoan ritual cocktail of beer mixed with wine, mixed with mead, is very interesting. It's even more interesting that you find that across the Aegean, in Gordium at King Midas's tomb, right? The same kind of ritual cocktail, which Pat and Sam at the Dogfish Head Brewery resurrected as the Midas Touch. So, the notion that we can go back, find this data, resurrect it, in some cases 2,800 years later, I found pretty exciting 10 years ago.
Yeah, bring it back for research. But that's fascinating that people were playing with these ideas. And we'll return to, well, first of all, we don't seem to understand from where intelligence came from. We don't understand from where life came from on Earth. But that we can kind of intuit because that's in the space of chemistry and biology. You have good theories about the origins of life on Earth. But the origins of intelligent life, that is a giant mystery. And there's some sense in which, I don't know if you know the movie 2001: Space Odyssey, but it does seem that there's like important throughout human history, throughout life on Earth, there's important phase shifts of, it feels like something happened where there's big leaps. It could be something coincidental like fire and learning how to cook meat and all those kinds of things. But it feels like there could be other things. And I think that's at the core of your work, is exploring what those things could be. Is it possible? Talked about Joe Rogan offline. Is it, and it's entirely possible. Is it possible that psychedelics have in fact contributed of being an important source of those phase shift throughout human history, of the intellect, basically steering the intellectual development and growth of human civilization?
It's a hypothesis worth investigating. How about that?
Beautiful.
And maybe not psychedelics in and of themselves, but I think our whole conversation is kind of wrapped up in these non-ordinary states of awareness. We start by talking about God, which is something unordinary and expansive. And I think that as you trace the intervention of divinity, if that's the case, throughout human history, you have to bump up against the irrational. Mircea Eliade, the great scholar of religions and fellow Romanian, said that the history of religions essentially constitutes the point of intersection between metaphysics and biology, right? So that we are biological beings who do interact with our planet, with the natural kingdom. And you would think that as, early archaic ecologists, we would have figured out what plants work, which fungi don't, and developed maybe language around that. And so this is another one of McKenna's speculative but very interesting hypotheses, the stoned ape theory. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that psychedelics were involved in one of the several leaps forward? You mentioned the word leap. Jared Diamond talks about the Great Leap Forward 60,000 years ago. The species had been around for a couple 100,000 years. All of a sudden, the cave painting appears. All of a sudden, there's a phase shift. Did something like that happen millions of years ago? And I love the way Paul Stamets talks about this. It would be the ingestion of perhaps psilocybin-containing fungi millions and millions of times over millions and millions of years. So it's not just a one-time event that cascades, but it's the accumulation of psychedelic experience. It's really difficult to test that hypothesis. But I've been talking with a paleoanthropologist in South Africa, my friend Lee Berger, about ways that we might test for this. And so Lee, amongst many things, is this National Geographic explorer. He's the paleoanthropologist at the University of Witwatersrand. He's famous, amongst other things, for the discovery of previously undiscovered hominids like Homo naledi. And there's an interesting point. So naledi is this archaic hominid, morphologically archaic, but it dates to about 300,000 years ago, which is very strange. What's even more strange about Homo naledi at the Rising Star Cave System there in South Africa is that Lee believes he's discovered the first bipedal ape deliberately disposing of its dead. So there is a recognition of self-mortality and the practicing of rituals around death. We're talking about burials. And if you have burials, says Lee, in an archaic hominid 300,000 years ago, maybe you have language. And I mention that because Terence McKenna was obsessed with language in the stoned ape theory, that the ingestion of psilocybin, in addition to enhancing visual acuity, perhaps facilitating sexual arousal, leads to proto-language. Now, isn't it interesting, this could be entirely a coincidence, that the largest sound inventory of any language is the Khoisan of Botswana and Namibia. They have something like 164 consonants and 44 vowels. English, by comparison, has about 45. So I don't know what to make of this, but what you find in that part of the world is very, very complex language. Language that could be an inheritance. Language that could be incredibly archaic, together with this recognition of self-mortality. And when I talk to Lee Berger, we say, when you're looking at universals like that, language around all human populations, the recognition of self-mortality, the contemplation of death, just maybe you have pharmacology. And so maybe we can go out and test for this using gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, proteomics, technology that doesn't even exist. But maybe we can actually test the stoned ape theory to figure out once and for all if there's any merit there.
Can you just linger a little bit on the pharmacology tools? Like how would it be possible to say something about what was being ingested so long ago?
That's what I asked Dr. Berger. So Lee has discovered in the dental calculus of archaic hominids.
Dental calculus. I like this.
Evidence of their diet. And you might not believe how old this was, but in Sediba, Australopithecus sediba, they found evidence of Sediba's diet going back 2 million years. So through things like phytoliths, which are essentially fossilized plant tissue, they found evidence that Sediba was eating bark and leaves and grasses and fruits and palm. So no psychedelics to speak of, but it just goes to show that through things like dental microwear analysis and other techniques that we're still developing, we can actually figure out what the diet was at the time. I'll fast forward to 50,000 years ago. There was another study out of El Cidrón Cave in 2012, which found that Neanderthals, again, preceding our species 50,000 years ago, were ingesting yarrow and chamomile, which had been identified as medicinal. So again, not psychedelic or psychoactive, but we kind of have the beginnings of the technology, and that was 9 years ago, to begin figuring out the ancestral diet of these hominids.
Presumably there could be a way to figure out it's not just diet, but which have psychoactive elements to them. So whether you're chewing it, whether you're smoking it, I don't know licking it. I don't know if there's any kind of ways through the dental calculus to figure out what exact substances were being consumed. Is it possible to figure out whether psychedelic substances are being consumed by looking at human behavior? Like you said, organized burials or cave paintings. No, but so that's a little bit of a stretch to say, like, where did this leap come from?
But it's not. It's not. So just last fall, as a matter of fact, so that notion's been out there for a while. The idea that hallucinogens and the ritual consumption of hallucinogens were somehow related to the Great Leap Forward, were somehow related to the initial cave painting. Graham Hancock wrote a beautiful book about this called Supernatural, which in many ways sent me down this rabbit hole back in 2007. And so, but even at the time when he was writing that and the years subsequent, it was still kind of seen as a kooky idea. Last fall, interestingly enough, the first archaeochemical data for the ritual consumption of psychedelics associated with cave art was finally published. It's not that ancient. It's only about 400 or 500 years ago, but it came from the Pinwheel Cave, a Chumash site in California. And what they found were datura quids, like these chewed up, you mentioned how did they ingest it? These chewed up quids, like these bunches of datura, which contain these very powerful tropane alkaloids, and what was believed to be some kind of Chumash initiation site. So we can say that there is initial, archaeochemical data for the consumption of psychedelics and cave art. And so where else might we find this?
Are there a lot of archaeochemists in the world? Because this is fascinating. Is through chemistry, through biology, through physics, whatever, like all the disciplines perhaps one day computer science, we apply those tools to study not the data of today, but the data of the past. Are we talking about dozens here? How hard is this problem relative to how many people are taking it on? Just as a side little tangent.
We're probably talking more dozens than hundreds. Okay. I spent many years trying to track down an archaeochemist who would talk to me. There were a couple, Pat McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania, and then my friend Andrew Coe at MIT, which you might know something about. Andrew really, on his own time, on his own dime, has been gathering the data for this organic residue analysis. He has what's called the Open Archem project, which is this online open source repository for this data. But there's never been a center for this. No university has stood up a dedicated center, a team, really, which is what you need, of archaeochemists looking at this stuff. But even despite that, there have been some remarkable discoveries over the past 10, 20 years. It's still a discipline very much in its infancy. Maybe it's becoming a toddler, but as the technology gets better and cheaper, I hope you'll see more and more archaeochemists joining the fight.
Yeah, and Andrew is fascinating, his work. Speaking of aliens, offline, you mentioned elves
Yeah.
and psychedelics.
Yeah.
What do you think about psychedelics in terms of the kind of places that can take your mind, or the kind of journey it can take you on? Like, what do you think? What do you think the psychedelics do to the human mind, and what does that say about the capacity of the human mind, and just in general, like the mysteries of all that's out there?
I don't know that we understand what they do. The way I heard it explained to me is that much of the human mind isn't about receiving information, but blocking information, right? Because there's so much data coming in any moment that you basically have to train yourself to see and to hear only what you want to see and to hear. And that what psychedelics do is they tear that away, and suddenly you're much more aware of what's out there. And also you're going to be noticing patterns that you hadn't noticed before. I know you had that researcher on the show, and he kind of discussed this at some length. I mean, Rogan is probably the person who popularized DMT more than well, he's obviously the person who's popularized DMT more than anything. I don't know anyone who has, even the researchers who have anything close to a coherent explanation of why this drug, which exists everywhere, would have this very specific, very extreme effect on so many people who are going to be experiencing such bizarre consequences as a result of it. I think it's very interesting that this is talking about the government. The CIA started experimenting with LSD. They killed one of their own people, drove them to suicide. And there was a lot of research into, Terence McKenna talks about this, into this field. And then very quickly, once it got into the mainstream, they shut it down, even though it's not addictive, doesn't cause you to go crazy or anything like that. And there was a lot of propaganda against its use, which I think, thankfully, is now somewhat receding. I think in Colorado just legalized mushrooms, something like that. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens as a result of this.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is there doesn't seem to be, for certain psychedelics like psilocybin, like mushrooms, there doesn't seem to be a lethal dose, which is fascinating. Like Matthew Johnson, the Hopkins professor that you mentioned, I'm definitely going to do one of his studies. It's a really cool way to do what he calls a heroic dose of psilocybin.
I want to do it. What do I have to do? Let's do it.
I'll let you know. So he is
a heroic dose. Holy crap!
Yeah, but it's safe.
What's how many grams are we talking?
I don't know, but it's just it's big. He says that
this is gonna have a kick.
Yeah. So he says that, I mean, he also studies cocaine, he studies all kinds of drugs, and he's like, the psilocybin is
heroic dose of cocaine kills you.
Well, you can't even come close. So he says, like, the problem with studying cocaine is you have like people who are addicted to cocaine,
yeah,
or war or so on. You give them the kind of doses that we can, and part of the study is like it's nothing to them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Psilocybin is the only one where like even like daily users or like regular users like are blown away by the dose they give them.
Oh, fuck.
So
okay, well, we're going back to Russia.
You can go to Russia in your mind.
Yeah.
You could go to outer space. Maybe you'll become an astronaut or astronomer. Yeah. After all,
maybe I'll be Baba Yaga.
I'll let people look that one up.
Holy crap! Wow.
Can we go to that world of psychedelics for a bit?
Sure.
Where do you think? So Joe Rogan apparently and many others meet apparently elves when they on DMT. A lot of people report this kind of creatures that they see, and again, it's probably the failure of language to describe that experience. But DMT is an interesting one. There's as you're aware, there's a bunch of studies going on psychedelics currently, MDMA, psilocybin, in John Hopkins and a bunch of other places. But DMT, they all speak of as like some extra super level of a psychedelic. Yeah. Do you have a sense of where it is our mind goes on psychedelics, but in DMT especially?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't taken DMT. So
Unfortunately or fortunately?
Unfortunately,
Okay,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Although I presume it's in my body as it is in everyone's brain and in many, many plants, apparently. But I've wanted to take it. I haven't been. I had an opportunity that was presented itself where it was obviously the right thing for me to be doing. But for those who don't know, DMT is often touted as the most intense psychedelic and also the shortest acting. I mean, you smoke it and it's basically a 10-minute experience or a 3-minute experience within like a 10-minute window. That when you're really down after 10 minutes or so. And Terence McKenna was a big proponent of DMT. That was his, the center of the bullseye for him psychedelically, apparently. And it is characterized, it seems, for many people by this phenomenon, which is unlike virtually any other psychedelic experience, which is it's not just your perception being broadened or changed. It's you, according to Terence McKenna, feeling fairly unchanged, but catapulted into a different circumstance. You have been shot elsewhere and find yourself in relationship to other entities of some kind. Right? So the place is populated with things that seem not to be your mind.
So it does feel like travel to another place because you're unchanged yourself.
Again, I just have this on the authority of the people who have described their experience, but it sounds like it's pretty common. It sounds like it's pretty common for people not to have the full experience because it's apparently pretty unpleasant to smoke. So it's like getting enough on board in order to get shot out of the cannon and land among the what McKenna called self-transforming machine elves.
Yeah.
That appeared to him like jeweled, Fabergé egg, like self-dribbling basketballs that were handing him completely uninterpretable reams of profound knowledge. It's an experience I haven't had, so I just have to accept that people have had it. I would just point out that our minds are clearly capable of producing apparent others on demand that are totally compelling to us, right? There's no limit to our ability to do that, as anyone who's ever remembered a dream can attest. I mean, every night we go to sleep, some of us don't remember dreams very often, but some dream vividly every night. And just think of how insane that experience is. I mean, you've forgotten where you were, right? That's the strangest part. I mean, this is psychosis, right? You have lost your mind. You have lost your connection to your episodic memory, or even your expectations that reality won't undergo wholesale changes a moment after you have closed your eyes, right? Like you're in bed, you're watching something on Netflix, you're waiting to fall asleep, and then the next thing that happens to you is impossible. And you're not surprised, right? You're talking to dead people. You're hanging out with famous people. You're someplace you couldn't physically be. You can fly, and even that's not surprising, right? So you have lost your mind. But relevantly for this,
or found it,
you found something. I mean, lucid dreaming is very interesting because then you can have the best of both circumstances, and it's then it can be kind of systematically explored.
But what I mean by found, sorry to interrupt, is like if we take this brilliant idea that language constrains us, grounds us, language and other things of the waking world ground us, maybe it is that you've found the full capacity of your cognition when you dream or when you do psychedelics. You're stepping outside the little human cage, the cage of the human condition, to open the door and step out and look around and then go back in.
Well, you've definitely stepped out of something and into something else, but you've also lost something, right? You've lost certain capacities.
Memory?
That you want. Well, just in this case, you literally you don't have enough presence of mind in the dreaming state, or even in the psychedelic state if you take enough.
To to do
you
math.
There's no there's very little psychological continuity with your life, such that you're not surprised to be in the presence of someone who you should know is dead, or you should know you're not likely to have met by normal channels, right? You're now talking to some celebrity, and it turns out you're best friends, right? And you have no memory of how you got there. Like, how did you get into the room? You're like, did you drive to this restaurant? You have no memory, and none of that's surprising to you. So you're kind of brain damaged in a way. You're not reality testing in the normal way.
The fascinating possibility is that there's probably thousands of people who've taken psychedelics of various forms and have met Sam Harris on that journey.
Well, I would put it more likely in dreams, not, because with psychedelics, you don't tend to hallucinate in a dreamlike way. I mean, so DMT is giving you an experience of others, but it seems to be non-standard. It's not just like dream hallucinations, but to the point of coming back to DMT, the people want to suggest, and Terence McKenna certainly did suggest, that because these others are so obviously other and they're so vivid, well, then they could not possibly be the creation of my own mind. But every night in dreams, you create a compelling, or what is to you at the time, a totally compelling simulacrum of another person, right? And that's... that just proves the mind is capable of doing it. Now, the phenomenon of lucid dreaming shows that the mind isn't capable of doing everything you think it might be capable of, even in that space. So, one of the things that people have discovered in lucid dreams, and I haven't done a lot of lucid dreaming, so I can't confirm all of this. I can confirm some of it. Apparently, in every house, in every room in the mansion of dreams, all light switches are dimmer switches. Like, if you go into a dark room and flip on the light, it gradually comes up. It doesn't come up instantly on demand, because apparently this is covering for the brain's inability to produce from a standing start visually rich imagery on demand. So I haven't confirmed that, but that was people who've done research on lucid dreaming claim that it's all dimmer switches. But one thing I have noticed, and people can check this out, is that in a dream, if you look at text, a page of text, or a sign, or a television that has text on it, and then you turn away and you look back at that text, the text will have changed. Right, there's the total is just a chronic instability, graphical instability of text in the dream state, and I don't know if that maybe that's someone can confirm that that's not true for them, but that's whenever I've checked that out, that has been true for me.
So it keeps generating it like real time, from a video game perspective.
Yeah, it's re-rendering it.
I mean, since we brought up drugs, let me ask you. This is becoming more and more a part of my life because I'm talking to a few researchers that are working on psychedelics. I've eaten shrooms a couple of times, and it was fascinating to me that the mind can go just fascinating. The mind can go to places I didn't imagine it could go, and it was very friendly and positive and exciting, and everything was kind of hilarious in the place. Wherever my mind went, that's where it went. What do you think about psychedelics? Do you think they have? Where do you think the mind goes? Have you done psychedelics? Where do you think the mind goes? Is there something useful to learn about the places it goes once you come back?
I find it interesting that this idea that psychedelics have something to teach is almost unique to psychedelics, right? People don't argue this about amphetamines. And
That's true.
And I'm not really sure why.
Yeah.
I think all of the drugs have lessons to teach. I think there's things to learn from opiates. I think there's things to learn from amphetamines. I think there's things to learn from psychedelics, things to learn from marijuana. But also at the same time, recognize that I don't think you're learning things about the world. I think you're learning things about yourself.
Yes.
And, it might have even been might have even been a Timothy Leary quote. I don't want to misquote him, but the idea is basically like, everybody should look behind the door, but then once you've seen behind the door, you don't need to keep going back. So, I mean, and that's my thoughts on all real drug use too, except maybe for caffeine.
It's a little experience that is good to have, but
oh yeah, no,
really
I mean, yeah, I guess psychedelics have definitely.
So you're a fan of new experiences, I suppose.
Yes,
because they all contain a little, especially the first few times, it contains some lessons that can be picked up.
Yeah, and I'll revisit psychedelics maybe once a year. Usually smaller doses. Maybe they turn up the learning rate of your brain. I've heard that. I like that.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, big learning rates have pros and cons.
With MDMA.
Is there something general to say about what the psychedelics do to the human mind? You mentioned kind of an ego loss experience. In the space of Venn diagrams, if we were to like draw a big circle, what can we say about that big circle?
In terms of people's report of subjective experience, probably one of the most general things we can say is that it expands that range. So many people come out of these sessions saying that they didn't know it was possible to have an experience like that.
So there's an emphasis on the subjective experience that is there words that people put to it that capture that experience, or is it something that just has to be experienced?
Yeah, people like.
As a researcher, that's an interesting question because you have to kind of measure the effects of this, and how do you convert that into numbers?
Right.
That's the ultimate challenge. So how is that possible to one convert it into words, and the second convert the words into numbers somehow?
So we do a lot of that with questionnaires, some of which are very psychometrically validated. So lots of numbers have been crunched on them. And there's always a limitation with questionnaires. I mean, subjective effects are subjective effects. Ultimately, it's what the person is reporting, and that doesn't necessarily point towards a ground truth.
Right.
So for example, if someone says that they felt like they touched another dimension, or they felt like they sensed the reality of God,
Mm-hmm.
or if they, I mean, just you name it, people's ontological views can sometimes shift. I think that's more about where they're coming from, and I don't think it's the quintessential way in which they work. There's plenty of people that hold on to a completely naturalistic viewpoint and have profound and helpful experiences with these compounds. But the subjective effects can be so broad that for some people it shifts their philosophical viewpoint more towards idealism, more towards thinking of that the nature of reality might be more about consciousness than about material. That's a domain I'm very interested in. Right now, we have essentially zero to say about that in terms of validating those types of claims, but it's even interesting just to see what people say along those lines.
So you're interested in saying, like, can we more rigorously study this process of expansion? Like, what do we mean by this expansion of your sense of what is possible in the experiences in this world?
Right, as much as what we can say about that through naturalistic psychology.
Right.
Especially as much as we can root it to solid psychological constructs and solid neuroscientific constructs. I mean, I'm always aware of the fact that we always as humans and as scientists think that we figured out 99% and we're working on that first 1%, and we got to keep reminding ourselves it's hard to do. We figured out not even 1%.
Yeah.
We know nothing.
Yeah.
And so I can speculate, and I might sound like a fool, but what are drugs? Even the concept of drugs, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, if we're surviving, molecules that go to a specific area of the brain in combination with technology, in combination with the magnetic stimulation, in combination with the, targeted pharmacology of this subset of serotonin 2A receptors in the claustrum, at this time in this particular sequence, in combination with this other thing, this baseball cap you wear that has, has one of the is doing some of these things that we can only do with these like giant like pieces of equipment now. Like where it's going to go is going to be endless, and it becomes easy to combined within virtual reality, where the virtual reality is going to move from being something out here to being more in there, and then we're getting, like we talked about before, we're already in a virtual reality in terms of human perception and cognition models of the universe being all representations, and color not existing, and just our representations of EM wavelengths, etc. Sound being vibrations and all of this. And so as the external VR and the internal VR come closer to each other, like this is what I think about in terms of the future of drugs. Like all of this stuff sort of combines, and like where that goes is just it's unthinkable. Like we're probably gonna, again, I might sound like a fool, and this may not happen, but I think it's possible, to go completely offline, like where most of people's experiences may be going into these internal worlds. And I mean, maybe you through a combination of these techniques, you create experiences where someone could live 1,000 years. In terms of maybe they're living a regular lifespan, but over the next 2 seconds, you're living 1,000 years worth of experience
inside your mind
through through this manipulation of is that possible? Like just based on like first principles and like
principles, yes.
I think so.
Yeah.
Like give us another 50, 100, 500, like who knows? But like how could it not go?
Can you give an introduction to psychedelics, like a whirlwind overview? Maybe what are psychedelics, and what are the kinds of psychedelics out there, and in whatever way you find meaningful to categorize.
Yeah. You can categorize them by their chemical structure. So phenethylamines, tryptamines, ergolines. That is less of a meaningful way to classify them. I think that their pharmacological activity, their receptor activity is the best way. Well, let me start even broader than that, because there I'm talking about the classic psychedelics. So broadly speaking, when we say psychedelic, that refers to, for most people, a broad number of compounds that work in different pharmacological ways. So it includes the so-called classic psychedelics. That includes psilocybin and psilocin, which are in mushrooms, LSD, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, it's in ayahuasca, people can smoke it too, mescaline, which is in peyote and San Pedro, cactus. And those all work by hitting a certain subtype of serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. They act as agonists at that receptor. Other compounds like PCP, ketamine, MDMA, ibogaine, they all are, more broadly speaking, called psychedelics, but they work by very different ways pharmacologically. And they have some different effects, including subjective effects, even though there's enough of an overlap in the subjective effects that, people informally refer to them as psychedelic. And I think what that overlap is, compared to say, caffeine and cocaine and, Ambien, et cetera, other psychoactive drugs, is that they have strong effects in altering one's sense of reality and including the sense of self. And I should throw in there that cannabis, more historically, like in the 70s, has been called a minor psychedelic. And I think with that latter definition, it does fit that definition, particularly if one doesn't have a tolerance.
So you mentioned serotonin. So most of the effect comes from something around like the chemistry around neurotransmitters and so on. So it's chemical interactions in the brain, or is there other kinds of interactions that have this kind of perception and self-awareness altering effects?
Well, as far as we know, all of the psychedelics of all the different classes we've talked about, their major activity is caused by receptor level events. So either acting at the post-receptor side of the synapse. So in other words, neurotransmission operates by, one neuron releasing neurotransmitter into a synapse, a gap between the two neurons, and then the other neuron receives. It has receptors that receives, and then there can be an activation caused by that. So it's like a pitcher and a catcher.
Yep.
So all of the major psychedelics work by either acting as a pitcher, mimicking a pitcher or a catcher. So for example, the classic psychedelics, they fit into the same catcher's mitt on the postsynaptic receptor side as serotonin itself. But they do a slightly different thing to the cell, to the neuron, than serotonin does. There's a different signaling pathway after that initial activation. Something like MDMA works at the presynaptic side, the pitcher side, and basically it floods the synapse or the gap between the cells with a bunch of serotonin, the natural neurotransmitter. So it's like the pitcher in a baseball game all of a sudden just starts throwing balls like every second.
Everything we're talking about, is it often more natural, meaning found in the natural world? You mentioned cacti, cactus. Or is it chemically manufactured, like artificially in the lab?
So the classic psychedelics, there's...
what are the classics? So
yeah.
Using terminology that's not chemical terminology, not like the terminology you see in titles of papers, academic papers, but more sort of common parlance.
Right. It would be good to kind of define their effects, like how they're different. And so it includes LSD, psilocybin, which is in mushrooms, mescaline, DMT.
Which one is mescaline? Sorry.
Mescaline is in the different cacti. So the one most people will know is peyote, but it also shows up in San Pedro or Peruvian torch. And all of these classic psychedelics, they have, at the right dose, and typically they have very strong effects on one's sense of reality and one's sense of self. What some of the things that makes them different than other, more broadly speaking, psychedelics like MDMA and others is that they're, at least the major examples, there are some exotic ones that differ, but the ones I've talked about are extremely safe at the physiological level. Like there's like LSD and psilocybin, there's no known lethal overdose unless you have like really severe, heart disease, because it modestly raises your blood pressure. So
right.
Same person might be hurt shoveling snow or going up the stairs, that could have a cardiac event because they've taken one of these drugs. But for most people, someone could take 1,000 times what the effective dose is, and it's not going to cause any organ damage, affect the brainstem, make them stop breathing. So in that sense, they're freakishly safe at the physiological. I would never call any compound safe because there's always a risk. They're freakishly safe at the physiological level. I mean, you can hardly find anything over the counter like that. I mean, aspirin's not like that. Caffeine is not like that. Most drugs, you take 5, 10, 20, maybe it takes 100, but you get to some times the effective dose and it's going to kill you.
Yeah.
Or cause some serious damage. And so that's something that's remarkable about most of these classic psychedelics.
That's incredible, by the way, that you can go on a hell of a journey in the mind, like probably transformative, potentially in a like deeply transformative way, and yet there's no dose that in most people would have a lethal effect. That's kind of fascinating. There's this duality between the mind and the body. It's like it's the okay, sorry if I bring him up way too much, but David Goggins is like the kind of things you go on a long run, like the hell you might go through in your mind. Your mind can take a lot, and you can go through a lot with the mind, and the body will just be its own thing. You can go through hell, but after a good night's sleep, be back to normal, and the body is always there.
So bringing it back to Goggins, it's like you can do that without even destroying your knee or whatever,
right.
or coming close and riding that line.
That's true. So the unfortunate thing about the running, which he uses running to test the mind, so the aspect of running that is negative, in order to test the mind, you really have to push the body, like take the body through a journey. I wish there was another way of doing that in the physical exercise space. I think there are exercises that are easier on the body than others, but running sure is a hell of an effective way to do it.
And one of the ways that where it differs is that you're, unlike exercise, you're essentially, most exercise to really get to those intense levels, you really need to be persistent about it.
Right.
I mean, it'll be intense if you're really out of shape, just, jogging for 5 minutes. But to really get to those intense levels, you need to, have the dedication. And so some of the other ways of altering subjective effects or states of consciousness take that type of dedication. Psychedelics, though, I mean, someone takes the right dose, they're strapped into the roller coaster. And something interesting is going to happen. And I really like what you said about that distinction between the mind, or the contrast between the mind effects and the body effects, because I think of this. I do research with all the drugs, caffeine, alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, alcohol, legal, illegal. Most of these drugs, thinking about, say, cocaine and methamphetamine, you can't give to a regular user, you can't safely give a dose where the regular cocaine user is going to say, oh man, that's the strongest Coke I've ever had, because, you get it past the ethics committee and you need approval. And I wouldn't want to give someone something that's dangerous. So
Yes.
to go to those levels where they would say that, you would have to give something that's physiologically riskier.
Yeah.
Psilocybin or LSD, you can give a dose at the physiological level that is very good chance it's going to be the most intense psychological experience of that person's life.
Yeah, that's
and
amazing.
have zero chance for most people, if you screen them, of killing them. The big risk is behavioral toxicity, which is a fancy way of saying doing something stupid. I mean, you're really intoxicated, like if you wander into traffic or you fall from a height, just like plenty of people do on high doses of alcohol. And the other kind of unique thing about classic psychedelics is that they're not addictive, which is pretty much unheard of when it comes to so-called drugs of abuse or drugs that people, at least at some frequency, choose to take. Most of what we think of as drugs, even caffeine, alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, most of these you can get into alcohol, you can get into a daily use pattern. And that's just so unheard of with psychedelics. Most people have taken these things on a daily basis. It's more like they're building up the courage to do it, and then they build up a tolerance. Or they're in college and they do it on a dare. Can you take acid 7 days in a row, and that type of thing, rather than a self-control issue where you have and say, oh God, I got to stop taking this. I got to stop drinking every night. I got to cut down on the Coke, whatever.
So that's the classic psychedelics. What are the what's a good term? Modern psychedelics, or more maybe psychedelics that are created in the lab? What else is there?
Right. So MDMA is the big one, and I should say that with the classic psychedelics, that LSD is sort of, you can call it a semi-synthetic, because there's natural, from both ergot and in certain seeds. Morning glory seeds is one example. There are some very close chemical relatives of LSD. So LSD is close to what occurs in nature, but not quite. But then when we get into the other non-classic psychedelics, probably the most prominent one is MDMA. People call it ecstasy. People call it Molly. And it is it differs from classic psychedelics in a number of ways. It can be addictive, but not so. It's like you can have cocaine on this end of the continuum and classic psychedelics here.
Continuum of addiction.
So it's certainly no cocaine. It's pretty rare for people to get into daily use patterns, but it's possible. And they can get into more like, using once a week pattern where they can find it hard to stop. But it's somewhere in between, mostly towards the classic psychedelic side in terms of like relatively little addiction potential. But it's also more physiologically dangerous. I think that certainly the therapeutic use, it's showing really promising effects for treating PTSD. And the models that are used, I think those are extremely acceptable when it comes to the risk-benefit ratio that you see all throughout medicine. But nonetheless, that we do know that at a certain dose and a certain frequency, that MDMA can cause long-term damage to the serotonin system in the brain. So it doesn't have that level of kind of freakish bodily safety that that the classic psychedelics do. And it has more of a heart load, a cardiovascular. I don't mean kind of emotion. I mean, in this sense, although it is very emotional, and that's something unique about its subjective effects, but it's more of a pressor.
And the terminology used instead of like a freakish capacities, allowing you from a researcher perspective, but a personal perspective too, of taking a journey with say some of these psychedelics that is the heroic dose, as they say. So like these are tools that allow you to take a serious mental journey, whatever that is. That's what you mean. And with MDMA, there's a little bit, it starts entering this territory where you got to be careful about the risks to the body potentially.
So yes, that in the sense that you can't kind of push the dose up as high as you safely as one can if they're in the right setting, like in our research, as they can with the classic psychedelics. But probably more importantly, the nature of the effects with MDMA aren't the full on psychedelic.
Got it.
It's not the full journey, So it's sort of a psychedelic with rose-colored glasses on. A psychedelic that's it's been called more of a heart trip than a head trip. The nature of reality doesn't unravel as frequently as it does with classic psychedelics.
But you're able to more directly sense your environment. So your perception system still works. It's not completely detached from reality with MDMA.
That's true, relatively speaking. That said, at most doses and of classic psychedelics, you still have a tether to reality. Right. Changes a little bit when you're talking about smoking DMT or smoking 5-methoxy-DMT, which are some interesting examples we could talk more about. But with with MDMA, it's for example, it's very rare to have a what's called an ego loss experience, or a sense of transcendental unity, where one really seemingly loses the psychological construct of the self, but MDMA, it's very common for people to have this, they still are perceiving themselves as a self, but it's common for them to have this warmth, this empathy for humanity and for their friends and loved ones. So and you see those effects under the classic psychedelics, but that's a subset of what the classic psychedelics do. So I see MDMA in terms of its subjective effects is, if you think about Venn diagrams, it's sort of MDMA is all within the classic psychedelics. So everything that you see on a particular MDMA session, sometimes a psilocybin session looks just like that. But then sometimes it's completely different with psilocybin. It's a little more narrowed in terms of the variability.
This is a little bit of a general question, but almost a bigger picture question that we touched on a little bit, but let's just touch it in a full way, which is what have all the psychedelic studies you've conducted taught you about the human mind, about the human brain and the human mind? Is there something, if you look at the human scientist you were before this work and the scientist you are now, how has your understanding of the human mind changed?
I'm thinking of that in two categories. One kind of more scientific. I mean, they're both scientific, but one more about the brain and behavior and the mind, so to speak. And as a behaviorist, I always see sort of the mind as a metaphor for behavior. So, but anyway, that gets philosophical. But it's really increasing so the one category is increasing the appreciation for the magnitude of depth. I mean, so these are all metaphors of human experience. That might be a good way to, because you use certain words like consciousness and whatnot. It's like we're using constructs that aren't well defined, and unless we kind of dig in. But into human experience, like that, the experiences on these compounds can be so far out there or so deep. And and they're doing that by tinkering with the same machinery that's going on up there. I mean, my assumption, and I think it's a good assumption, is that all experiences, there's a biological side to all phenomenal experience. So there is not, the divide between biology, and experience or psychology is it's it's not one or the other. These are just two sides of the same coin.
I mean, you're avoiding the use of the word consciousness, for example, but the experience is referring to the subjective experience. So it's the actual technical use of the word consciousness of subjective experience.
And even that word, there are certain ways that like sort of like if we're talking about access consciousness or narrative self-awareness, which is an aspect of like you can wrap a definition around that and we can talk meaningfully about it, but so often around psychedelics it's used in this much more in terms of ultimately explaining phenomenal consciousness itself, the so-called hard problem, and relating to that question, and psychedelics really haven't spoken to that, and that's why it's hard, because like it's hard to imagine anything. But I think what I was getting is like that psychedelics have done this by the reason I was getting into the biology versus mind psychology divide is that just to kind of set up the fact that I think all of our experience is related to these biological events. Mm-hmm. So whether they be naturally occurring neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, et cetera, and a whole other sort of biological activity and kind of another layer up that we could talk about is network activity, communication amongst brain areas. Like this is always going on. Even if I just prompt you to think about a loved one, like there's something happening biologically. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's always another side of the coin. So, and another way to put that is all of our subjective experience outside of drugs, it's all a controlled hallucination in a sense. Like this is completely constructed. Our experience of reality is completely a simulation. So I think we're on solid ground to say that that's our best guess, and that's a pretty reasonable thing to say scientifically.
I think all the rich complexity of the world emerges from just some biology and some chemicals.
So in that definition implied a causation, it comes from, and so that's we know at least there's a solid correlation there. And so then we delve deep into the philosophy of like idealism or materialism and things like this, which I'm not an expert in, but I know we're getting into that territory. You don't even necessarily have to go there. Like you at least go to the level of like, okay, we know there seems to be this one-on-one correspondence, and that seems pretty solid. Like you can't prove a negative, and you can't prove, it's like in that category of like, you could come up with an experience that maybe doesn't have a biological correlate, but then you're talking about there's also the limits of the science. So is it a false negative? But I think our best guess and a very decent assumption is that every psychological event has a biological correlate. So with that said, the idea that you can alter that biology in a pretty trivial manner. I mean, you could take like a relatively small number of these molecules, throw them into the nervous system, and then have a 60-year-old person who has, you name it. I mean, that has hiked to the top of Everest and that speaks 5 languages and that has been married and has kids and grandkids and has, you name it, like been at the top, and say, this fundamentally changed who I am as a person and what I think life is about. Like that's the thing about psychedelics that just floors me, and it never fails. I mean, sometimes you get bogged down by the paperwork and running studies and all of the BS that can come with being in academia and everything. And then and sometimes you get some dud sessions where it's not the full, all the magic isn't happening. And it's, more or less it's either a dud or somewhere and I don't mean to dismiss them, but it's not like these magnificent sort of reports, but sometimes you get the full Monty report from one of these people and you're like, oh yeah, that's why we're doing this. Whether it's like therapeutically or just to understand the mind. And you're like, you're still floored. Like, how is that possible? How did we slightly alter serotonergic neurotransmission and this person is now saying that they're making fundamental differences in the priorities of their life after 60 years.
It also just fills you with awe of the possibility of experiences we're yet to have uncovered. If just a few chemicals can change so much, it's like, man, what if this could be I mean, like, how, because we're just like took a little, it's like lighting a match or something in the darkness, and you could see there's a lot more there, but you don't know how much more. And that's
Right. And then, like, where's that going to go with, like...
So Lisa Feldman Barrett, I'm not sure if you've done work together, but at least you're...
I found out about her because of you and your
sure.
podcast with her. And then I brought her onto Instagram to do an Instagram live about emotion.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating. And she's a very spirited and very, very smart woman. And
fearless
yeah.
and brilliant. So I love her. She's amazing. She's not a scholar of hallucinogens or dreams, but she had this intuition that there may be a connection between the kind of dissociation that happens in dreaming and that happens in like psychedelics. Because of my previous conversation with you on this podcast, Matthew Johnson from Johns Hopkins reached out, and he said, but he commented, I think, on something that we commented on. I don't even remember exactly what, but that there's not many studies. It's not being psychedelics are not being rigorously studied in an academic setting, like with the full rigor of science. And he said, well, actually, that's exactly what we're doing, and they're extremely well funded now. And it's been a long battle to get it accepted as a serious scientific pursuit. So, and I'd like to ask you a little bit about that. But
sure.
do you have a sense about connection between dreams and psychedelics, or these different explorations of mind states that are outside of the standard normal one? That's the wake mindset.
Yeah, I loved your discussion with Matthew. I knew of the Hopkins group and the stuff they were doing, but I didn't know much about it at all. And I learned a ton from that podcast. I reached out to him just to say, love what you're doing. I think it's incredible. So yeah, your podcast has been a great source of serious academic and intellectual conversation for me. I think what they're doing at Hopkins is amazing. He has a collaborator there, actually, that had a very popular paper I just throw out there for fun, who was a postdoc at Stanford. Her name is Gül. She's Turkish, I believe. And I apologize, her last name escapes me at the moment, but that's just a function of my brain. She had a paper showing that she put octopi on MDMA, on ecstasy, and found out, this was published in Current Biology, showing, it was a great journal, showing that the octopi then wanted to spend more time with other octopi, and they started cuddling.
Yeah.
So they're colleagues out there. But the Hopkins project is super interesting because I think they were initially supported mainly through private philanthropy. Mm-hmm. And now you're starting to see some more interest at the level of NIH about psychedelics. It's a complicated space because the psychedelics are always looked at through the lens of the 60s and people losing their mind. And there's I always say, you don't want to Ken Kesey out of the game. Ken Kesey was amazing, right? Part of the whole Beat Generation thing. And he was actually at the VA near Stanford. That's where he eventually, in Menlo Park, he wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or maybe that was about him. Anyway, the comments will tell me how wrong I am, but I think I'm tossing these words in the right general direction. But, Huxley, Kesey, they did a lot of LSD, and they all lost their jobs. Right? They lost their jobs at big institutions like Harvard and Stanford and elsewhere, or they left because they made themselves the experiments.
Yes.
Hopkins, as far as I know, is one of the first places, if not the first place, where whatever Matt may or may not be doing in his own life, I don't know, it's really about the patients and whether or not the patients in these institutional review board approved studies, whether or not they're getting better in situations like depression. I think it's clear that there's a very close relationship between hallucinogenic states and dreaming of the sort that were described for REM dreaming. Mm-hmm. And there's a terrific set of books and body of scientific literature from a guy named Alan Hobson, who was an MD, is at Harvard Med, and he wrote books like Dream Drugstore. Mm-hmm. One of the first neuroscience books I ever read was about hallucinations and how psychedelics and dreaming are very similar. That was way back when I was in high school. I was just curious. And he really understood the relationship between LSD and REM dreams and how similar they are. I think psychedelics, and Matt knows way more about this than I do, of course, but psychedelics have some very interesting properties. They are certainly not for everybody, right? And kids, it's a problem. I think the major issues right now around the psychedelic conversation is that it's clear that they can unveil certain elements of neuroplasticity. They make the brain amenable to change, changing up space-time relationships, changing up the emotional load of an event and being able to reframe that. It's clear that happens. But there's two major issues. One is that people talk about plasticity as if plasticity is the goal, but plasticity is a state within which you can direct neurology. And the question is, what changes are you trying to get to? So people are just taking psychedelics to unveil plasticity without thinking about what circuits they want to modify and how. I think that's a problem. I think there's great potential, however, for people opening up these states of plasticity with psychedelics or otherwise and directing the plastic changes toward a particular endpoint. And there's an absolutely spectacular paper out of UC Davis, published as a full article in Nature just a couple months ago, showing that there are psychedelics that are now can be modified. So chemists have gotten into the game now and modifying to take away the hallucinogenic component where you still get the neuroplasticity components.
Wow.
And for a lot of people, it'd be like, oh, well, that's no fun. That's not giving you the wild experience. But I do think that holds great potential for people that wouldn't otherwise orient towards some of these drugs. So I think it's really marvelous what's happening and what's about to happen. And I think there is one drug in that kit of drugs that's very unusual, like psilocybin, LSD. Those promote heavy serotonin release and lateralized connections ramp up, et cetera. Matt talked about all that. But MDMA, ecstasy, is a very unusual situation where dopamine is very, very high because of the way the drug is designed. Dopamine release, it goes through the roof. So people feel great and they want to move and they have a lot of energy. But serotonin levels are also high. And that's a very unnatural state. And why MDMA may, and I want to highlight may, have particularly high potential for the treatment of certain forms of depression is an interesting question, because never before as far as we know, in human history, has there been a possibility of opening up dopaminergic and serotonergic states at the same time. Dopamine being the molecule of pursuit and reward and more, and serotonin being one of bliss and being content right where you're at. So it's almost like those two things wrap back on themselves and create this very unusual state. And I think the bigger conversation is what to do with a state like that. Like, is it about self-love? Is it about developing love for another person? Is it about forgetting hate? Like, these are powerful molecules. And I think if the academic community and the clinical community is going to move forward with them in any serious way, I think there needs to be a conversation about what they're being used for.
Right. And coupled with that, I think similar to what you're saying, like Matt has talked about, as others have talked about, some of the biggest benefits of like progress, whether it's like quitting smoking and all this kind of stuff, is in the days after. It's the integration of the experience. So maybe you open up the brain to the neuroplasticity, but then there's like work to be done. It's not you shake up something in the biology of the brain, but you have to do then its work.
Absolutely. A friend of mine who's a physician, he says, who's quite open to this idea that psychedelics could play a real role in real medicine, says better living through chemistry still requires better living. And I think it's a beautiful statement. I wish I had said it, but he gets the credit. But the plasticity window opens, and then, as you said, what are you going to do in the 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks afterward? Because that's the real opportunity. But those psychedelic experiences are really a case of an amplified experience inside of an amplified experience, so much so that everything seems relevant. Yeah. And it's fascinating. I mean, my hope is that the AI and machine learning and the brain machine interface and all that will eventually be merged with the psychedelic treatments, so that an individual can go in, take whatever amount of whatever's safe for them, working with a clinician, and really direct the plasticity while maybe stimulating the medial orbital frontal cortex, or increasing the observer or decreasing the observer in the brain, or decreasing the amygdala. I mean, it's doable. It's doable with transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it's for shutting down activity, and it's doable with ultrasound. Ultrasound now allows very focal activation of particular brain regions through the skull non-invasively.
So it's approaching the same kind of therapy from different angles. One of AI is the computational side, sort of injecting like the robotics, injecting like maybe you can even think about it as like electricity, the electrical approach versus then like the chemical approach.
Absolutely. And then the psychology is subjective, right? So it's going to take some real understanding of what that person's lexicon is. Like, that wasn't a pun. Sorry. Sorry, it's terrible. I'm like the worst. That's the one thing I know from the feedback on my podcast. My jokes are terrible, but I never claim to be funny. But somebody who they really trust and understands when somebody says, for a very stoic person, like I'm imagining you interviewed the great Dan Gable. Right. I don't know anything about Dan, but can you imagine like you asked Dan, like, how you feel about something while on one of these drugs? And like, I mean, his languaging might, if he says that was troubling, it might mean that it was very troubling or not troubling at all. So language is a poor guide, because if I say I'm upset, how upset is that? Well, that's very subjective. So can you build a tool for that? Can you build an AI tool for that?
Yeah, deeper. Yeah, well,
maybe that's the eye. Maybe that's that's what the eyes could reveal.
So language is not just words; it's everything together, and that's one of the fascinating things about the eyes and the window to the soul. I mean, they express so much: the face, the eyes, the body. Lisa talks about that, the communication of emotions. It's a super complex. This study paints a fascinating picture of a future. Where first for medical applications, but then also in general, psychedelics of various forms could be used by the broader society. Forgive the perhaps ridiculous question, but if much of society, including our politicians, are taking psychedelics and dissolving their ego and going through this whole process, how do you think the world may look different in 20, 30, 50 years?
Okay. So I said that I think license legalization happens in 2035.
Yes.
All right. So, and I think by 2050, we will have enough people, hopefully spiritualized. We're also talking about we hear so much in terms of climate change about net zero carbon. So our goal is net zero trauma. When do we have a world with net zero trauma? I mean, right now, we have 2 sites in Israel. So we help a few people, but the recent war with Gaza has traumatized millions of people on both sides. So we are a long way away from net zero trauma. But that's the hope. And that's, I think, possible. I think humanity as a whole is like lemmings heading over a cliff with climate change and with the nuclear proliferation and just the religious hatreds and the retreat to authoritarianism and fundamentalism and tribalism. So I think that there's a very good chance, though, that psychedelics used wisely. So it's not just make psychedelics legal and everybody takes them. And, as you talked about Ted Kaczynski, it's the context that people take it in. But I think that there's a reasonable chance that enough people can sort of, you could say, clean their filters to see people as more similar to them than different, not to label them as the enemy. Stan Grof, again, had this beautiful phrase about transparent to the transcendent. That's what, yeah. So for our ego, can we be transparent to the transcendent? Because can the filter that we look through the world at be cleaned to, you could say, cleansing the doors of perception? Can it be cleaned to the point where we can see the humanity in everybody and see that? One way to say this is that can we get to the point where religions are seen as like languages, where we all have this need to communicate? There's thousands of different languages. We don't say that this language is fundamentally better than this language. This language is the only right language. Everybody must speak English, and Russian is bad or German is bad. maybe we'll get to that point that that religions are like that they're different cultural backgrounds, different symbol systems, different saints and heroes and messiahs and all this, but that, Jesus is the Son of God, but so is everybody, or,
Yes.
The Jews are the chosen people, but so is everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So can we get there? I think that we can. And I think that we need to survive the challenges that we're facing. And the hope is that by bringing psychedelics as tools forward and trying to bring the context around them to be one of responsibility rather than just profit maximization and just, get as many people to do them from all these for-profit companies, can we, and then also drug policy reform and embed knowledge in the society, can we get to honest drug education? DARE, the Drug Awareness Resistance education, is fundamentally twisted. But it's the program that's used in a lot of schools now.
Mm-hmm.
So can we get honest drug education, pure drugs, harm reduction, and knowledge about therapeutic uses, and on the one hand, and more of these thousands of psychedelic clinics? I'm hopeful, and that's.
So you mentioned this idea of bringing something to the surface, which is really interesting. So can you maybe elaborate the surface and what is there in the depths of things, and how does ego dissolution fits into that?
Well, Aldous Huxley talked about the brain as a reducing valve, that we have an enormous amount of information. So right now there's an air conditioning sound in the background,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not crucial to what you and I are doing, talking to each other. So we kind of tune that out. There's all sorts of sights and sounds. There's incoming information in all the different sense modalities. And we have to figure out what's important to us. And so the mind, in a way, focuses a lot on what are our core needs, and we filter all the incoming information that we get towards focusing on what our core needs. And we can even get to Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs about survival needs, belonging needs, esteem needs. You go on. So I think what I mean by bringing things to the surface is that we tend to not focus on a lot of things that are coming, but we also push away things that are difficult emotionally, difficult cognitively. We all know that we're on this very short trajectory from birth to death, but we're not constantly thinking about dying. Although that can actually be helpful to focus us on what's really important. Traumas are often suppressed. Conflicts. We see in America and around the world a kind of rise of irrationality, where people push away their logic in order for their emotional, tribal needs to be met. A lot of people are suffering from early childhood traumas of a different kinds, or abandonment issues, or anything. So we tend to focus on just what we need to survive and what we need for work and esteem. And so psychedelics, by dissolving this ego control, or with MDMA kind of strengthening our sense of self and our sense of self-acceptance, we can bring in other information that have previously been too complicated or too painful.
You don't think of psychedelics as conjuring up something new. It is more revealing something that is already there.
I think that's a very crucial thing. So, yes, Sasha Shulgin, who sort of the godfather of MDMA, he sort of rediscovered it and brought it back into use. He talked about his first experience was with mescaline. His first psychedelic experience was with mescaline. And he had a tremendous experience. But what he said about it was he was having a human experience that the mescaline was helping him access, rather than that he was having a mescaline experience. So that it's not like you pop a pill and you always have the same kind of experience as everybody else. The experience is not contained in the pill. The pill opens you up and you have an experience of yourself sometimes these are experiences that we've never consciously had. But we can say right now that we know that our body below the level of our conscious awareness has all these self-healing mechanisms. And we don't modulate them to a large extent by conscious control. I mean, eventually we are learning more about the mind-body, and we learn about the placebo effect, how what we think is the case. But I think that there's experiences that are below our level of conscious awareness, particularly once we're adults, that are more these unitive mystical experiences, sense of connection. You know, I think kids are like this a lot. We kind of come from the void, you could say, and you're born and you have a different way of processing information. One interesting point about that has to do with ketamine, which is, been approved S-ketamine for depression, but it's used for anesthesia. And roughly 1/10 the anesthetic dose is a psychedelic dose. And when it's used in anesthesia, there's what's called the emergent phenomena. So this is, you get enough ketamine for, you can be operated on, you're not in pain, you're not really there, your ego's knocked out, but you can still breathe. But as the operations get over and then people metabolize the ketamine, there's a process that they call the emergent phenomena. It's like as you're emerging from this tranquilized state, and that's where you pass through the psychedelic phase. And they don't prepare people for that. And what we see is that a lot of adults have difficult times with that. But children don't seem to have those problems. Children are a little bit more already in this kind of state. And so ketamine is used quite frequently in children now for anesthesia. So all of that is to say, to your question, that I think these psychedelics reveal things that are within us, some things that are how we process information back when we were children, other things that we've never thought of before that are sort of baked into our consciousness. There's one drug, 5-MeO-DMT. It's this toxin from a Sonoran toad that many people consider it to be the most powerful of all the psychedelics. And it kind of knocks the ego structures completely out of it. And we experience something different, but it's something I think that's always within us. It's at a deeper layer. So we knock out some of the higher cognitive functions, and then we experience things in a different way. So my sense is that these are human experiences that the psychedelics bring us to.
Yeah, it's really profound. DMT is a really interesting example. So Terence McKenna has talked about these machine elves, right? And there's this, I think from the people I've heard speak about the experience, there's a sense that you are traveling elsewhere to meet entities, whether they're elves or not. So in your sense, you're not traveling elsewhere. You're just revealing something that's within, and maybe it's a particular mechanism of revealing what's already within.
Yeah, and I knew Terence. I spent a lot of time talking with Terence, and I do not ascribe to a lot of things that he was saying. He was a tremendous entertainer, and I think he did a lot of really good things and focused us on, the power of psychedelics. But I think I've never seen these, quote, machine elves. Okay. I think culture is more determinative of what people experience under psychedelics, your preconceptions, than we give it credit for. And so I think there's a lot of priming that you could say that people receive by stories from their culture. With ayahuasca, it's about jaguars and Amazonian animals. And so I think these machine elves are this construct of Terence that other people do see. There's actually some people that are very interested in doing a study, and that they're well funded and moving toward it to keep people on an IV infusion of DMT for them specifically to see, do they contact machine elves or aliens, and what kind of information do they bring back from these other selves, other places or other entities. One question is, who are we? Are we connected to everything in the universe? We certainly know in many cases, you talk about waves or particles, the quantum approach. So I don't interpret experiences that we have of some entity that's, somehow or other deep in our consciousness that's not us. It's a part of who we are. So I tend to interpret it in that way.
The question is, how big are we?
Yeah.
I mean, that's and how many ideas are within us that can be revealed by changing the perspective. You mentioned physics. What physicists, especially mathematical physicists or mathematicians, do is they reveal truths by taking a slightly different perspective on a problem that reveals the simplicity of how it actually works in totally new ways. That's what Einstein did. That's what every progress in physics, and certainly every progress in mathematics, requires you to take a different perspective. And then perhaps that's exactly what psychedelics are doing. It's not that they're contacting aliens that are elsewhere. It may be revealing the connection between us and other living life forms, or actually it might be revealing a totally new perspective on what life is or what consciousness is, and giving us a glimpse at that, even though our cognitive capabilities are limited to fully grasp and understand it. So it's just giving us an inkling of that somehow. And it seems perhaps a little ridiculous, not from a scientific perspective, in the sense that we don't have a good physics of life or physics of intelligence or a physics of consciousness, but getting a glimpse of that is giving us a little bit of maybe an intuition of which way to head to build such a physics.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's this other concept I guess I would like to talk about briefly, this Jungian collective unconscious. This idea that somehow or other everything that has ever happened is still accessible, maybe not with as much data or as much resolution, but that there's, wave resonances, so that I do believe that we can have experiences as part of this human collective unconscious that we're not from our own life.
Yeah.
And that we can, it's like the holographic realities, and that there is a way to gather information that can be accurate about other times and places through depth investigations of our own consciousness. But I think what I tend to believe is that it's because there's emotional resonances between where we're at now in this life and, other kind of experiences that people have had before. And, we always hear about everybody who talks about past life, they're always kings and queens,
Yeah.
So I think that's, that's again, you filter things, what you want to be true. But I do think that there is a way to access information beyond what we've taken in our own temporal existence through our own five senses.
In some ways, I really find that compelling, the notion that information is already there, and you're simply just moving the attention of your mind to different parts of that.
Yeah. I mean, we have that with the radio. I mean, you got a frequency, you turn all this information. You could actually say right now, in the space between us, we have the whole world's knowledge that's up on the internet.
Yeah.
It's right here.
Yeah.
But
we
don't
just have
see
to
it.
tune in.
Yeah. That happening too.
That's really fast. I mean, there's a lot of doors you've opened, and we're going to walk through all of them, including the research and so on. But on this one little tangent of the future of psychedelics, so engineering new psychedelics, can you comment on maybe the chemistry and the biology of how psychedelics work, and where is the space of possible engineering of psychedelics, and what kind of things might they unlock in terms of the possible places our mind would be able to go, and the effects of that, of improving health, but maybe at the basic level of chemistry and the space of what could be engineered.
Well, you reminded me, it's not, I'll get to exactly what you said, but you reminded me of a talk I heard by Buckminster Fuller shortly before he died. Mm-hmm. And what he talked about is how technology was making things ever smaller. That we are able to pack more and more information into smaller and smaller spaces, and that we're developing technologies of communications with people. We now know the internet and things like that. But what he said is that he thought the eventual evolution of this sort of research would move from this miniaturization to telepathy.
Yeah.
and I was like, a shocking thing for somebody like scientific like that to say that.
Yeah.
So will we unlock those parts where I talked about the collective unconscious? Will we be able to more consciously explore those areas? So I think that that's a possibility.
That's fascinating.
There was Stan Groff, who's the world's leading LSD researcher and has been my mentor. His wife Brigitte, they were talking about stories that they had heard about MDMA that people take, and then on top of that they do 5-MeO-DMT. And so you get this ego dissolution, but underneath it you have this sense of ego, sort of sense of self, of safety, of self-acceptance, kind of grounds it. So Stan was like, that's the future of psychiatry. That you can watch without the terror of the ego dissolution, the sense that you're losing your mind or you're going crazy or you're dying, or that you have this grounded sense of safety while you're dissolving your normal sense of how you see things.
And being able to engineer in a fine-tuned way that exact experience may be fine-tuned to the person, as opposed to sort of this manual potion that's through
well, I don't
experiment.
Yes, although I don't know about fine-tuning things to the person in the sense that we believe there's this inner healer, this kind of inner healing intelligence. We talked about it. The body repairs itself. So I think we more need to create safety for people, and then what emerges will be customized to what they need to be looking at from this inner healing intelligence. At the same time, we will move to, we hear so much about the new approaches to oncology, where you do genetic analysis of different kind of tumors, and then you have certain kind of chemotherapy agents, and you do like personalized chemotherapy. I think we will have more like personalized psychedelic therapy, but it'll be more like a sequence of different drugs that people go through over an extended period of time, and then you kind of customize what's next. And sometimes you'll combine different drugs together, like this 5-MeO-DMT and MDMA, or a lot of times people do LSD-MDMA combinations or psilocybin-MDMA combinations. Chemistry and is not my strength. I'm more into clinical applications and policy, but I can say that from what I've learned from reading from others and research done by others, that different psychedelics have an impact on different neurotransmitters, different other parts of energies in the brain. The default mode network is what's considered to be like our sense of self, and it's part of the brain that sort of is what I described before, scanning the world and filtering information for what's really important to us, and both focusing us on things and also helping us to ignore a lot of things. And the classic psychedelics all weaken the energy in this default mode system, and therefore you get this flood of information that you're not normally paying attention to, and then you start seeing in more creative waves or more connected. You actually move to beyond the verbal kind of thinking into sort of symbolic thinking a lot of times. And that's where you sometimes get these mystical sense of connection, how it's all one. And you get this sense also of how big the universe is and how small each one of us is. So there's a lot of work that Sasha Shulgin and Albert Hofmann, who invented LSD and first synthesized psilocybin, on what they call structure-activity relationships. What is the structure of the molecule? And then how do you predict what that new molecule that never existed before is going to do once you actually take it? And you can get close, but you never really know until you actually take the drug. And the way that Sasha ran his experiments is that he would take the drugs himself first, in low doses, and he would sort of, step up the doses to have more experiences. If he thought it was valuable, he'd share it with his wife, Anne. But then what they would do is, if they both thought it was valuable, they had a group of 12 people that they were with for many, many years. And they would distribute these new drug to these 12 people, and they would get the different perspectives. And he felt that 12 was like a minimum number, because we're so unique how each of us see things. But then you kind of get a little bit of a consensus on how a lot of people are going to see it. And then if that 12 people were positive about it, then they would turn it over to Leo Zeff, who we called the secret chief, the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement, and then he would start exploring it in therapy. So there's still a lot of mysteries as far as structure-activity relationships, and it's not going to be the case that people go into the lab and they tinker with molecules and they know exactly what they're going to get. And a lot of it has to do with the not so much chemistry as morphology. You could say the shape of the molecule and how does that interact with receptor sites. And so we're getting better at modeling all of that.
And how does that interaction relate to the morphing of the human experience, and deeply understanding that perhaps there's no equations yet for that kind of thing. You really have to build up intuition by experiencing it. And over time, and through sort of subjective self-report, like trying to build an understanding of the effects of the different chemistries.
Yeah. You can have approximate ideas, but to know exactly. So, when I first tried MDMA, which was 1982, and this was after I had done lots of LSD and mescaline and mushrooms, I was shocked at how different it was than these other substances, and yet how profound it was. So are there whole new kind of categories of classes of drugs that we're not aware of that would be not so much this like eco-dissolution or emotional? Well, what MDMA does is reduces activity in the amygdala, the fear processing part of the brain. So it's not just chemistry, but it routes energy throughout the brain in a different way. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, so you think more logically. That I think has an enormous impact on the effect of MDMA. The other thing it does is it increases connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus. So it helps facilitate processing of things into long-term memory. And with PTSD, trauma is like never in the past. It's always about to happen. So,
yeah, we'll talk about psychedelics and treating, in bringing some of trauma to the surface and dealing with all those kinds of things. But there's something also to the opening up of creativity, for whether it's for writing purposes or for in my world, for engineering, for invention. Innovation and invention itself is a deeply creative process. And it's fascinating to think, with the aid of psychedelics, what kind of ideas can be brought to life.
Yeah, well, we have the whole phenomena of a lot of the people in Silicon Valley and else microdosing psychedelics in order to have a little touch more of this creative approach to things.
I would love it to see if it was, that's more like Terence McKenna territory, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would love to sort of more scientific, to where there would be the rigor of saying how to do it effectively, how to sort of understand sort of not just almost, to take the full journey of creative exploration and to do it for prolonged periods of time, for years, lifelong kind of part of your life, of how it empowers creativity. I think, of course, you start with helping people deal with trauma, and then the next step is people who have moved past their trauma and are trying to do something, create something special in their life. How can then psychedelics empower that?
Yeah. Now, that also, just to not shy away from anything controversial,
yes,
that gets us to this idea of psychedelics for vision quest, particularly for younger people. When you're sort of moving into this adulting kind of phase and you have to figure out what are you going to do with your life, there's so many options a lot of people, of course, feel constrained that they have very few options. But I think this idea of psychedelics as a way to help you find your calling or find your vision or find your unique leverage point, I think we'll see that more and more as our culture evolves and gets healthier around the use of psychedelics.
So it's both the science, having the rigor of understanding how to do it safely, and the culture catching up to the fact that this is both safe and like very useful.
Yeah, although I would question this idea of safety. So we can understand physiological risks and we can minimize them. And I think there's very minimal physiological risks from the classic psychedelics, virtually none, or for even MDMA under safe conditions. Psychological risks are harder to address, but we can do that through the sense of safety and support. But I think there's a level of risk there that we shouldn't overlook. And so, to make a drug into a medicine, what we have to do is prove to the satisfaction of the FDA and other regulatory agencies that things are safe and efficacious. Mm-hmm. But even though they use those words, proving safety and safe and efficacious, it's in relationship to the disease that you're trying to treat, and you accept a certain amount of risk. So it's the risk-benefit ratio rather than pure safety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Could you give an introduction to psychedelics, like a big, bold whirlwind overview? What are psychedelics? What are the kinds of psychedelics out there? In whatever way you think is meaningful.
All right. Well, when I started MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, it was very important for me that psychedelic be in the name. And the way in which the original meaning of psychedelic, it's mind manifesting. It was created by Humphrey Osmond in dialogue with Aldous Huxley. And so psychedelic means mind manifesting. And so we interpret that very broadly to mean dreams are psychedelic. Anything that kind of brings things to the surface. Holotropic breath work, hyperventilation is psychedelic. So most people think psychedelic is only about certain kind of chemical substances, either natural or synthetic, but we've got a much broader view of that. Meditation can be psychedelic in some ways. But our primary focus is on the drugs, is on the medicines, or you might call, some people might call them spiritual tools or sacraments. There's sort of two general categories of those. One are what are called the classic psychedelics, and those are the ego-dissolving, sort of merge into unitive states. Those are like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, ayahuasca, ibogaine, DMT, things like that. And then there's MDMA, which some people even argue is not a psychedelic. They'll say it's an empathogen or an entactogen. It's about touching within or empathy. It doesn't do the same kind of ego dissolution that the classic psychedelics do, but it brings material to the surface, and it changes the way we process information. And so I think you can quibble about whether it's certainly not a classic psychedelic, but I think MDMA is also a psychedelic. Marijuana, I would say, is a psychedelic. Marijuana is closer to the classic psychedelics than it is to MDMA. One point I like to make is dreams, because then everybody can relate to that. Dreams are psychedelic. Dreams bring emotions, feelings, ideas, concepts in symbolic form a lot of times, or just in raw emotions to the surface. So when people hear the word psychedelic, often they are frightened by it. It's about loss of control. And it is, to an extent, loss of conscious control, particularly with the classic psychedelics. But, and we know with dreams that we can have frightening dreams, nightmares. But I think that anchoring the concept of psychedelic in dreams is really helpful for people to know that it's kind of a natural state, and that there are other ways that you can catalyze it than by going to sleep, and that for thousands of years, substances have been used in that way.
What are the interesting differences would you say between the various psychedelics that you mentioned? Ayahuasca, DMT, acid, LSD, marijuana, mescaline, PCP, psilocybin, MDMA. All you mentioned a few of them. They're really interesting. We'll talk about scientifically some of the different studies that have been conducted on each, but sort of at the high level, what are some interesting differences?
Well, one of the big ones that people make a big deal of that I think is completely misplaced is some are from nature, some are from the lab.
Right.
So there's this kind of like romantic thought that if it's from nature, it's good. If it's from the lab, it's somehow tainted by humanity. Right. And, therefore some people are like all for plant psychedelics. We see the policy changes that have been happening in a couple cities, Cambridge, Somerville, right, not far from where we're at now, where they decriminalize plant medicines. So they call it decriminalizing nature. So I think that there is, from my perspective, certain things from nature are poison. Certain things from the lab are spiritual, even if they don't show up in nature, like LSD. Now, there is something. LSD is lysergic acid diethylamide. There is lysergic acid amide, LSA, which comes from morning glory seeds. So it's very similar. But at the same time, I'd say I don't buy into that distinction that there's some fundamental preference. One of the things that Terence McKenna, since we talked about him, he talked about how if it's from nature, it's good. And if it's not, we should be suspect. Of course, he had a lot of great LSD experiences. But actually, Terence, in 1984, we were at Esalen with a bunch of other people. This was before the crackdown on MDMA. And this was some of the underground therapists and the above-ground researchers who were trying to talk about how to protect MDMA from this eventual crackdown. And Terence was like, forget about it. It's from the lab. It's dangerous. We have thousands of years of history, all these other things. And, what do we know about MDMA and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, Terence, you're so unscientific. Bullshit. Another way to say it is, and I just said, we need a study of the safety of MDMA. And so then Dick Price, who started Esalen, I said, I'll put 1,000. Dick Price, he'd put 1,000. So Terence was actually the catalyst for the first study with MDMA.
Wow.
Just because he was so frustrating about how plants are okay and, if it's from the lab, it's bad. Yeah. So that's one distinction. The other distinction is this sense of classic psychedelics versus things like MDMA. So to what extent do they dissolve the ego? And you could say, to what extent do they cause visions, the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor subtype, which is responsible for a lot of that, where these drugs are activating. Now, mescaline, of all the psychedelics, chemically, it's the most similar to MDMA. It's a phenethylamine, which is MDMA. So in the 50s, there was the 53, I think it was, the Army Chemical Warfare Service wanted to look at drugs for interrogations, mind control, non-lethal incapacitants. They did a study in 8 substances. These were now toxicity studies in animals. And on the one side was methamphetamine, on the other was mescaline, and MDMA was in the middle, chemically. So mescaline of these psychedelics tends to have the a warmth that MDMA has. It's not as ego-dissolving quite as some of the others. I mean, it's the main active ingredient in peyote. It is very psychedelic, very visual. Another distinction with these different drugs is how long they last. And a lot of that has to do with the route of administration. So, for example, if you smoke DMT, it takes 10, 15 minutes, and within seconds, you're off in another world. Similarly, 5-MeO DMT, very rapid. When you take DMT in the form of ayahuasca, where it's mixed with another substance that makes it so that it's orally active, then it's a couple hours. So LSD is 8, 10, 12 hours sometimes. Psilocybin is more like 5 or 6 hours, or 4 to 6 hours. MDMA is similar. It's one reason why in our research we give an initial dose of MDMA, and then 2 hours later we give half the initial amount, to extend the plateau because we want it to last longer for people to be in this therapeutic state. So that's another distinction is, how long these drugs last. Another distinction is which of them come from a religious context, have a religion built around them. We have this sense that some people are saying that 5-MeO-DMT and the Sonoran toad, that they have this long history of indigenous use, but they don't. That's all modern. It's made up, and it's kind of a new approach. However, there was thousands of years of use of psilocybin mushrooms in religious contexts. From 1600 BC to 396 AD, the world's longest mystery ceremonies, the Eleusinian Mysteries, sort of the heart of Greek culture, the heart of Western culture. That was a psychedelic potion called Kykeon that seems like it's very much like an LSD-like substance. Ergot on grain, and LSD comes from ergot. So I think that there are a lot of ways to look at these different substances. Another distinction is, which one of them are being researched right now in scientific contexts and which are not. And because of the rise of all these for-profit companies and everybody's looking for what they can patent, what they can claim, the land grab, more and more there are companies looking at every different kind of psychedelics. The ones that are most important that are not being researched, mescaline, but now there's a company to do mescaline, a Journey Collab. Ibogaine, which is crucial for opiate addiction. There's a new company, a branch of this company, Atai, that's going to be looking at Ibogaine. So I'd say the rise of the for-profit companies is making it so that there's just going to be an enormous amount of investigations into all these different psychedelics. But what we're going to see is the development of new psychedelics that we don't know anything about, that have not existed yet, because a lot of these for-profit companies are going to want to invent and patent and have composition of matter patents on new molecules. So I think we'll see a lot of that of action.
Before I ask you about one but several really exciting studies, let me ask sort of a personal question for me. So if I wanted to get psychedelics from the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation and explore my own mind, how do I get to do that? And when?
You won't be able to. You'll never be able to.
This is very unfortunate.
Because the reason is because the Benefit Corp is designed as a pharmaceutical company. So we can only work on clinical indications. So let's say you come to me and you just say, I'm really depressed. Can I get MDMA to overcome my depression or overcome my PTSD? We'll have to do research in those indications.
And by when you say me, you mean like a doctor. So this would be prescribed in theory by doctors. So this would go through a doctor.
Yes.
And a prescription. Okay, let me ask another question.
But to further answer that, so that's where the drug policy arm comes in, the drug policy reform. So you should be able to get access to psychedelics for your own personal growth.
Yes.
But that's not medicine. So that's why we need to medicalize, to have things covered by insurance, to change people's attitudes, the public attitudes, and then we get this subsequent drug policy reform. And we're talking about it in terms of licensed legalization. So my view is you should get a license to do psychedelics, you get a little education stuff, and then you should be able to buy it and do it on your own.
So let me rephrase the question in more specifically. So when can I, if I happen to have ailments of some kind where the doctor decides that psychedelics could help, when would you be a loose estimate for you of when a doctor will be able to prescribe to me something from MAPS Public Benefit Co. And then when, for my personal growth and creativity, would I be able to get something? So like just looking out, this isn't like guaranteed, but like your vision, your hope for psychedelics in society.
Well, the end of 2023, so 2.5 years from now, we anticipate FDA approval for the prescription use of MDMA for PTSD. Because the FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine, there is what's called off-label prescription. What that means, the label is what it's approved for. So the label will say, this is approved for PTSD, But let's say you come and anything else, social anxiety or whatever, you can go to the doctor, they can give it to you. It might not be covered by insurance. They have to be a little bit careful about malpractice but I think the end of 2023 is when you will be able to do that. Now, there's actually another program, very limited, called Expanded Access, which is compassionate use, which means that, and we have approval for 50 people for compassionate use right now. We think that'll grow. So that's going to open up in about 2 months. And so those are people with PTSD. They have to be treatment resistant. Nothing has worked for them. And they can access MDMA while we're doing the phase 3 studies.
Wow.
But they have to pay for it themselves. The sponsor has to pay for all the research, but expanded access, because there's no control group, everybody gets the MDMA, people can pay for it themselves. And we think that'll start in a couple months. But it's very limited. It's limited to certain cities. There's also a program called Right to Try, which is passed through Congress. It's similar to this idea of compassionate use, but it cuts the FDA out of it, and patients can negotiate directly with pharma companies to get access to their drugs. That's starting to happen, I think, in Canada now. They're letting people have compassionate access to psilocybin for life-threatening illness, because there has been studies with psilocybin for cancer patients and others with life-threatening illness. As far as your question about when will you be able to access this for personal growth outside of medicine, I'll take that to mean, fully legally, where you can just go buy pure drugs somewhere. When will that happen? We already are starting to see the decriminalization in certain areas of plant psychedelics. And we see overall drug decrim, like that passed in Oregon, so that any drug is now, it's not legal. You can't really fully set up clinics to offer it to people, or there's no legal supply like that, but it's decriminalized. So my sense of things is based a lot on watching what happened with medical marijuana and marijuana legalization. So we're sitting here in Massachusetts where marijuana is legal, but what happened first was medical marijuana. So what we see is that medicalization, by demonstrating that under certain contexts, the risks are much less than the benefits, and then there are benefits. And then people hear stories about people that have gotten better, and then that changes their minds. And then eventually that builds up to, why are we throwing people in jail for this?
Shifts the culture, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that what we're going to have, 2023, is MDMA approved by the FDA, chances are. Psilocybin will be a year or two after that. Then what we're going to need is a decade of psychedelic clinics that are going to roll out across America, also other countries as well, thousands of these psychedelic clinics. We already have hundreds of ketamine clinics that are ketamine for depression. More and more people are realizing that ketamine, when it's used with therapy, it's better than when it's not. But the therapists want to be psychedelic therapists. They don't want to be a ketamine therapist or an MDMA therapist. So they'll be cross-trained. So we will have a decade of these thousands of psychedelic clinics and all these stories of people getting better. In 2035 is when I think that we will move to licensed legalization, which is when you will have the option of just going somewhere. Once you've done this educational stuff, potentially, I also think it would be better to have the opportunity for people to go for free, paid for by tax money, to these clinics, and you have your first experience with psychedelics under supervision. And you know what you're getting into. You've, passed a questionnaire, what the risks are with the drugs, then you get your license. So 2035 is when I think that'll happen. And the clinics will be sites of these initiations.
Yes. And so it'll be a safe environment, just like you said, all the things that are actually maximize the likelihood of a pleasant experience and all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
It is a frustratingly slow process. And the FDA being part of that process is very frustrating. That, of course, there's benefits, but boy, I wish it could move a lot faster.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've learned from being a parent is that when you have little kids, it seems like they'll be with you forever. But then when they grow up and they go to college and they leave, you look back and like, where did that 20 years go? So we're still dealing with the legacy of the Civil War and slavery in America.
Yeah.
So actually a 20-year plan is not that long.
Yeah.
So while we say it's frustratingly slow, and it is, You know, I mean, it's 50 years since the psychedelic 60s. And, you know, when right now it's, you know, it's 36 years since MDMA was criminalized. And you think about all those people that committed suicide from PTSD or from anything else, and all those people that could have been helped if the DEA had accepted the administrative law judge recommendation that MDMA stay in Schedule 3. It's tremendously sad. At the same time, culture evolves slowly. You know, you read the Bible or you read all this stuff, we're not that different from people thousands of years ago. So how are we going to really evolve enough over the next couple decades so we don't destroy the planet and don't kill each other? That's why I think psychedelics have an important role to play. That's why I've devoted my life to psychedelics. And it is frustratingly slow. And what I said to myself is our whole effort has not been fast enough.